let's go ahead and get
Yep,
going. And I apologize. We're a little bit late. It's right before a
yep.
holiday weekend. Sometimes these things happen. Um, but I'm really excited to talk with Jennifer Schulze. She is a fellow Chicagoan. And she's also a longtime journalist. She's been an executive at several TV stations at the Chicago Sun-Times, and she currently writes the Indistinct Chatter Substack about the media, and you
Mhm.
should definitely subscribe. And you can also find her work on The Contrarian and Heartland Signal. So thank you so much for being here, Jennifer.
Oh, I'm happy to. Thank you for having me. This is fun.
Great. Well, I know there's just so much to talk about when it comes to the media. But in the
Too
last couple
much.
too much. In the last couple weeks, there's been no shortage of news on the Trump front. You know, we've got his big, beautiful bill that will kick millions of people off their health care. That passed the House yesterday. He's busy spreading lies about a so-called genocide against white South African farmers, and now
Mhm,
he's offering them citizenship while
mhm,
he wants to yank protected status from Afghan refugees.
mhm,
He's threatening even
mhm.
more tariffs, and he was offered a $400 million luxury jumbo jet from Qatar. And that's just a few.
Mhm,
But really, like whenever I turn on the television or I read, you know, all the political, publications that I have for years and years as a junkie, there's been one story that has just dominated the news, and that's Jake Tapper's book on former President Biden's health.
mhm.
And, really, to me, that story isn't nearly as significant for people's lives as like their grocery bills going up, or, the cost of electronics going up because of
Mhm,
tariffs,
mhm.
or all of a sudden they can't afford to get cancer treatments because they
Right,
don't have health care anymore.
right.
So,
Mhm.
Jennifer, why do you think that the media outlets are so obsessed with this story?
Well, I think there's a couple reasons. One, you and I have both been in this business for a long time, and one thing you know about journalists is they love talking about themselves, and they
Yes.
love talking about their friends,
Yeah.
and they love supporting their friends, and it's a very cozy club. I have never worked in Washington. I had
Me either.
opportunities to, and I was not interested. I love Chicago too much, but I gather from what I have read and friends I have know that do work there, it's very cozy.
Hmm.
So I think that's part of it. Um, I think I don't want to say the book's not newsworthy. I think though that journalism, particularly DC, in the last 10 years, has trouble prioritizing,
Hmm.
and I think we all know that. We see that every day. We see it. We've seen it for years. We know that the seriousness, also the impacts of the things that are happening on real people's lives, it doesn't always seem to be a priority. That's not to say there's not great stories here and there,
Hmm.
and really with some regularity. But the things that catch people's attention and get the headlines and get journalists on social media really pumping stuff up is the stuff that isn't going to change how much things cost at my grocery store, isn't going to bring back cancer research. It's this crazy distraction almost. Again, I think the Biden story is interesting.
Hmm.
I think mistakes were made. Journalists make mistakes all the time. We should always look at them. But there's something that really bugs me about just how other journalists are letting themselves be distracted by this distraction when
Hmm.
everything you just said just happened this week.
Hmm.
And what do you think most people have heard about? They probably heard about the jet, right?
Hmm.
Because the jet's pretty sensational. They
Hmm.
may have a little bit of info about the cuts to Medicaid, Medicare, and all of that, but only a
Hmm.
little. But I'll bet you if you say Biden book, people are going to be like, oh, I heard something about that.
Hmm.
And that, I think, is a mistake.
It seems to me that the idea of news judgment is out the window. It's just, stories that weren't stories are covered to death now. And stories like the Biden book that I agree is news, but
Mhm.
they're given outsized importance.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that they're, when you spend a lot of time in Washington, I do think it's a bubble. And I do think that one thing that's been great about the rise of independent media is that you have people writing from all over the country and reporting on things. And so that's helped fill in some gaps, but
Mhm. Mhm.
most of the assignment desks are out in Washington or New York, and that's just the way it's always been. But what's interesting to you as a journalist is not necessarily interesting to other people, and so sure, I'm sure it's the talk of the town. Here's a story that I never told anyone, when I was interviewing Biden on Air Force One. But that's really not the experience of everyday people. And Biden is no longer president. And we have a president who is doing all sorts of things that really, do impact all of us in so many ways.
Mhm.
And it just doesn't seem like that's changed. Trump has always kind of followed the Bannon mantra of flood the zone with
Yeah.
shit. And
Yeah.
it seems to keep working. It's been 9 years since we've had Trump running for president and being president. And then claiming he had still won when he hadn't, all of that. So almost a decade. And it just feels to me that mainstream media just still hasn't quite figured out how to cover someone who is doing so many questionable things and lies so much of the time.
Well, I have a couple of thoughts about that. One, yes, you are absolutely right. There is independent media that, especially in Trump 2, has really done remarkable work. Wired, I think Mother Jones, there's a lot of
Hmm.
people with newsletters. Judd Legum is breaking news every day,
Hmm.
that and doing it in a thoughtful, detailed way where if you really want to find out about stuff, there are places to go. None
Hmm.
of them quite have the platform of a lot of these larger outlets, but I will say I think NBC News has done some really stellar work on Signalgate and other things like that. The New York Times has had some things. I have some issues overall with the New York Times, but
Hmm.
I think there's a group think, where
Hmm.
they're doing that story, so we're going to do that story, so we're all going to do that story, and that's the
Hmm.
story we're all going to do, and here we go. And that
Right.
collides with this phenomenon that I think has really wrecked so many things, and that's social media, right?
Hmm.
You want that thing, you think
Hmm.
you want that thing that's going to get you attention on social
Right.
media. Is it important? Is it a good story? Does it save democracy? Does it do anything meaningful
Hmm.
except get you more clicks or maybe even a TV contract? I mean,
Hmm.
I think the social media, hey, look at me,
Yeah.
attention grabbing thing is really one of the worst things that's happened to journalism. And I mean, I know ad sales disappearing obviously
Right.
kills a lot of journalism, but this attention grabbing thing collides with groupthink, and we're not
Hmm.
talking about what's happening to Medicare, are we? We're talking about that
Right.
damn book.
Right. Yeah, and I've noticed that, even down to like state house news reporters, a lot of tweets out there are, you know, very centered on I. And, those of us who have been journalists, dating back a few decades, it was just beaten into us, I is never part of the story. You are not the story. But yet on social media, it's like we're all the stars of our own little shows. And, when that's your focus, and when you know that maybe your next job depends on how many followers you have, because the next big outlet you're looking at, that's something very important to them. That becomes more important than what we're supposed to be doing, which is truth telling and educating people and, standing up to power. And,
Mhm.
those values don't really mesh very well. And it's
Right.
it's really a shame.
It is, and I've talked about this a lot, and it distresses me to no end, but journalism is more you're an independent brand, right?
Hmm.
And I get that if I'm somebody who's trying to piece together different kinds of work, I get that people knowing about what I'm doing and thinking it's good and finding out about it is important. But somewhere along the way, the need to get the attention for something that may or may not actually really be that important to the
Hmm.
country collides again with this, "Hey, look at me." And
Hmm.
it's, I've taught journalism kit students. I would not actually know how to counsel them in
Hmm.
this age. If getting attention gets you a better job, I
Right.
get that.
Hmm.
But is it journalism, or has it become something else? I think that's a question that we're going to struggle with for a while.
Right. And I mean, you're seeing that so many people, claim to, be journalists, so to speak, on TikTok with, zero training. And,
Oh, right. The
it's not a matter.
pretend jour
Yeah. Oh, go right
the
ahead.
TikTok journalists, right? They're
Right.
not journalists.
Yeah, and it's not really a matter of gatekeeping, but things like making sure that you have the right sources and you're not just making things up because it's fun or being sensationalistic. You don't really have an editor on TikTok,
No.
and a lot of those people, they're influencers, and so there are many people with agendas and money who are trying to push that out through them. And it's not about educating the public. It's
Mm-mm.
about, making sure that Elon Musk's brand is protected or,
Mhm, mhm,
whatever else.
mhm,
And so, yeah, I think, we're going to see the lines blur even more. And that's something
mhm.
we have to grapple with.
Oh, I know.
Um,
I don't know
eh,
how to answer that. I don't know how
yeah,
to deal with that problem because it's a problem.
it is. And, you were talking a little bit earlier about, what we've always called pack journalism, where, everybody runs to the same
Yes.
story. And one thing I've always been grateful for is, I started out in local news, and I know actually a lot of, journalists these days don't, they might go right to some of the bigger newsrooms because, there's been so many veterans who, have been pushed out in one way or another. But I didn't want to tell the same story as, the paper down the street or the news station next door. I wanted to get my own story because to me that was interesting, and that's the way that you can distinguish your reporting. And it takes you've got to check yourself because sometimes you might be on the wrong story.
Mhm,
There
mhm,
might be a reason why nobody else wants to cover
mhm,
this,
mhm,
so it's good
mhm,
to talk with your editor and
mhm,
make sure and talk with sources and make sure what you
mhm.
think is correct really is. But those stories can be so valuable because that sometimes people really aren't paying attention to something that's significant in the community.
Well, the great thing about local news is you're talking about your friends and your neighbors in the community
Hmm.
that you live in, and you're invested in what you're reporting on. I would hope, and it used to be that you would do stories, not all of them, but some where you were actually looking to affect some change, right? I
Right.
remember being in newsrooms where an investigative series that we did led to laws being changed, led to
I
new
know.
or something, and that was the goal. Of course,
Right.
that was all before, social media and all of this grabbing attention for myself issue.
Hmm.
But journalism, I'd like to remind people, is about telling people what's going on in their community, helping them understand things, and every once in a while making things better because
Right.
you've unearthed something that's brought to light and put pressure on people in power who have a role in all of that.
Right. And, we know that local news is really hurting, and there have
Hmm.
been so many job cutbacks,
Yep.
lots of like local radio stations, newspapers, even local TV stations have gone
Hmm.
under.
Hmm.
But I'm curious, how do you see how they've been covering Trump versus how some of the national outlets have?
Well, I have a lot of friends who my background is mostly television, right? I have worked at a couple of newspapers, like you mentioned, but I mostly worked in television. And so a lot of my friends and former colleagues are still in television. God bless them. Um, and they are, most of them are approaching it from the local impact
Hmm.
way. So I have a friend who's running a newsroom in Atlanta. What's happening at the CDC is the biggest story in that
Right.
community, unless a tornado comes roaring through, right?
Hmm.
I have a friend who runs a newsroom here in Chicago, and they are doing a lot by responding to viewer inquiries. And
Okay.
they've moved off, not completely, but they've moved on to doing a lot of things on YouTube that are separate from their nightly newscast because people are just not watching the actual newscast at the time that it's
Mm-hmm.
being presented. And they're doing more explainers about things. So, what is the Department of Education and what does it do? And they're doing reporter driven pieces where they're doing a lot more explaining because viewers have reached out to them and said, I don't get this. And that's an amazing thing, I think,
Hmm.
that, and it's an important role for local news to be doing. Mostly, people I know and the shows that I watch are they'll do a little bit of the national, but they almost always pivot to the local because
Hmm.
that's the job,
Right.
right?
Right. Absolutely. Um, so one of the biggest concerns that we hear from our subscribers is just their deep frustration in mainstream media coverage, especially of Trump this term. And, in general, a lot of these folks are the ones who subscribe to multiple
Hmm.
newspapers and,
Hmm.
they do turn on network and cable news.
Hmm.
So they're fans of the media. They haven't
Hmm.
just, they're not just haters.
Hmm.
But they feel let down. And so, we hear a lot that they feel like Trump is normalized, that, they give him a
Hmm.
pass. And, I find that very interesting because, for decades, all we would hear in the media is, you're liberal, you're biased, and that dominated so much of how we approach things because we wanted to make sure that we were being fair and objective and we never wanted to be called biased. But in reality, mainstream news outlets, whether it's cable news stations or big newspapers, are generally owned by very big corporations that are certainly not progressive. And there's of course an ever-growing glut of right-wing media out there, and they amplify Trump's lies 24/7. There's fact checking is not part of the job. But we are seeing this independent media, and yeah, a lot of it is here on Substack, but a lot of people have other platforms as well. And it's not just new publications like the Contrarian or
Right.
Lincoln Square. It's fascinating to see like journalists like Jim Acosta, go from CNN to just breaking on his own, and he's on all the time.
Hmm.
He's probably getting more airtime now. So, do you think that this, like, does that make you hopeful? What kind of role do you feel like independent media can play at this particular point in history?
Well, I think we're in an inflection point, right?
Hmm.
But I think it's really important to understand how the balance is. There is no balance. Right wing
Hmm.
media is dominant in America, and it isn't just Fox.
Hmm.
Right wing companies own local television stations, they own
Like
newspapers, they
Sinclair.
own radio, like Sinclair. And
Hmm.
this notion of the liberal media, which you and I have both heard our entire careers. Um, we need to be done with that because that is not true anymore. Sure, there are some that are, but we live in a country that is dominated by right wing media, not right wing news, because I won't give him any credit for that. I mean, for goodness sakes, this week on Fox and Fox Business, which I think is we might as well start calling it state media. They
Hmm.
were whipping the bill for Trump and Sean. I mean, they're like they are a part of the government,
Well, and
right?
actually, so many Fox veterans are. I mean,
Right. So
our Secretary of
right,
Defense.
right. But first of all, just understanding kind of where we are, and I think that's hard for people because I think the Republicans did a really good job for years of demonizing the media.
Mhm.
Trump, I mean, it's unbelievable what he's done and said, and he's obviously scared media companies. They're writing him really big checks, which is, I think, just out and out bribery. And what CBS is on the verge of, I think, doing something really hideous. And I
Right.
don't know where we go after that. 60 Minutes. Are those folks, if they write him a $50 million check because they did some editing differently for a promo as the show, and he gets 50 million for complaining about that? Do they stay? Does the show survive? What happens is,
Right.
I mean, I think there are huge questions ahead for that. But understanding the lay of the land, right wing media is dominant. And then if you want fact based media, supporting it in any way that you can so that we start to shift it a little bit. I
Mhm.
think there's a lot out there. Frankly, I'm subscribed to about 100 newsletters. I can't read them all. I can't
Right.
even read my own. I mean, I, there's, in a weird way, in a good way, there's almost too much because it's, so many individuals doing it. And
Mhm.
I love it. Don't get me wrong. But I do see that that's creating some tension too, because,
Mhm.
where do you go to get your information, and how am I going to read that email today, that
Mhm.
newsletter tomorrow? How am I going to keep, and where do I go to get the overview, which is, I
Mhm.
think, hard. That's the beauty, I think, of a newscast, frankly, or the old days of newspapers where you could, find out pretty much everything that was going on. Now
Yeah.
that's harder and harder.
Um, I did want to go to a story that's amusing, but also a little bit dystopian. Um, over the last week, we saw that there was a summer reading list that came
Oh,
out
yeah.
in
Right
both
here in Chicago, where I am.
The
Oh, yeah.
Chicago Sun-Times. Also, it ran in the Philadelphia Inquirer.
Hmm. Hmm.
And basically, the list had some real authors, but fake book
Hmm.
titles.
Hmm.
And as it turns out, it was partially generated by AI.
Hmm.
But the story doesn't end there. There was a very interesting article in Slate interviewing, the author, and it was not, just some 20-year-old who just wrote the thing with
Hmm.
AI. It was
Hmm.
someone who'd been a veteran reporter,
Hmm.
but in order to make ends meet, he has to take a lot of very low-paying freelance gigs, which
Hmm. Hmm.
I can certainly relate to. I've done that during
Hmm.
my career. I'm sure you have as
Hmm.
well.
Hmm.
And just to offset the workload, he admitted to using AI and didn't use the proper checks and balances. But, you know, um, that's kind of a side of the media that I hadn't really thought about. So, what do you make of all this?
Well,
Where are we heading?
I used to work at the Chicago Sun-Times. I'm familiar with the inserts. Inserts
Right.
are a common part of newspapers, even now. King Features produced it.
Hmm.
They've been running these inserts forever. They
Hmm.
get material from other sources for different parts of the paper.
Hmm.
Um, Part of the problem, I think, just at the newspaper level for both the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Chicago Sun Times is doesn't look like there was any oversight of
Hmm.
that product, which I think if it comes in your wrapper, if your name is on
Right.
it, you own it, and it's not okay. Which and they've said, "Oh my God, we're so sorry," but they sent it out.
Right.
So
I mean, if you run
somebody.
an ad in the paper, you're responsible for the content.
Yes. Yeah, so I was a little dumbfounded by that they had not but really bothered to edit it or to take a look at it. It is a remarkable thing. 404 Media has looked
Hmm.
at lots of sections of it, and it's not just the reading list. The reading
Hmm.
list, I think, is the most egregious. I believe there are 15 books, and only 5 of them are real authors and real
Right.
books. The rest are real authors, fake books.
Hmm.
And AI, I think, is a real challenge for just regular people and
Hmm.
journalists. Man, you better be careful. I, I don't know. There's a lot of good advice about how to use AI for consumers, and journalists. I, I think it's a sticky wicket that obviously created a huge problem. The Chicago Sun Times is seriously damaged by this error. I
Yeah.
don't know what's bubbling up in Philadelphia, but
Hmm.
this is an enormous error for, frankly, a publication that has a huge history in Chicago and has done a
Right.
remarkable work, but is really beleaguered. I mean, they just went through a bunch of layoffs. It's
Hmm.
hard, keeping it afloat.
Hmm.
Um, Man, you can't afford to make those kind of mistakes. And
Yeah.
and if using AI was a way of cutting corners or doing something because you didn't want to pay somebody else, I don't know, and vetting your contributors. I mean, that guy, there's no excuse. He said, I just read a new interview with him where he said,
Mm.
"Yeah, I screwed up. I should have looked more closely." You should have looked more closely is not a good answer.
Right. Yeah.
I'm sorry. But, oh my God. Yeah, it's terrible. And I'm sure we're going to see more of it, not less. And I'm sure we're going to see it in all forms of journalism. But listen, folks, as I said to my 92-year-old mother, when you Google something, scroll down to the
Right.
actual sources, zip past all of the AI stuff because it's too confounding to try to figure out what's real and what's not and look for
Right.
legitimate sources.
Yeah. Remember when Google used to be useful?
Oh
That.
my God, right? Now it's like
Yeah.
you're wading through it. You're like scrolling and scrolling. Is there a real source? Where's a legitimate source? It takes 3 clicks to find one. Yeah, it's not oof, rough, man.
Yeah. Yeah. I just find it amazing, and of course the New York Times had an expose of all of the kids that have been using AI in college, and people can graduate without having read a book. I have to admit I did talk with my college student son, and he's a history major, and I do believe him. He says he has never used AI for a single paper. And I'm glad, because especially in history, I'm sure that it would be very easy to get caught.
Hmm. Hmm. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Because the Civil War did not happen in 1972.
Oh man, journalism does not need another challenge, but man, this is definitely one,
Right. It's
right?
it's amazing, I mean, we already know that, especially with, like, covering sports, that, they are rapidly moving towards an AI model. But, even for reporters who are overworked, buyer beware with using too much AI.
Well, I'm just look at this guy who wrote this supplement. That's his livelihood. Um,
Right?
will somebody else hire him? It's just not worth it. Do the job of journalism.
Yeah.
Don't cut corners. I just don't think it's worth it.
Yeah. I would much rather have technology used to make it easier to vacuum my house or do the dishes. I can take care of the writing part.
Walk your dog, whatever. Right, right. Spell check.
Spell
That's all
check
we
is
need.
great.
Word count.
Absolutely. Oh, well, I so appreciate you being here this afternoon, Jennifer.
Oh well, thank you. It's fun.
Yeah, and thanks to everybody who joined us. I
Hmm.
know there's a ton more that we could have talked about when it comes to media coverage, especially, I hope you'll come back and we can
Oh
get more.
yes, I'm just gonna say
Yeah, we can. I
we we could do a weekly show.
we
Come on,
could.
Susan. We there's so much to talk about. It's never ending. I'll come back anytime you like. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I'm looking forward. We're going to be featuring some of Jennifer's writing on Lincoln Square. So check back for that. Subscribe to us and subscribe to her Substack as well, Indistinct Chatter. It's a great read, and it definitely stands out
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
because I read a lot on media. So I couldn't recommend it more. But thank you, and I hope everybody has a very safe weekend.
Yes.
Thank you.